Chapter 1. The Price of Freedom. The sprawling marketplace of Grixis Prime was a notorious hub for everything illicit. Stolen technology, forbidden weapons, rare biological specimens, and, most abhorrently, slavery. For retired human soldier Rylan Kane, the scene churned memories he'd tried to bury deep. The narrow, neon-lit alleys buzzed with chatter, alien tongues mixing in a chaotic chorus. Rylan adjusted the hood of his weathered cloak, obscuring his face as he moved through the crowd. Despite his apparent anonymity, his posture betrayed his training. A soldier, even retired, carried themselves with an unmistakable edge, calculated, deliberate. Grixis Prime wasn't a place for human ideals, but Rylan was here for a reason. To undo a piece of the galaxy's filth. He had spent years on the battlefield fighting against the Zyral Syndicate, one of the galaxy's largest slave trading cartels. His military campaigns had liberated countless colonies, but even after retiring, their reach continued to haunt him. The Syndicate operated here openly, protected by corrupt authorities and backed by bribes that kept their operations untouched. Rylan wasn't naive enough to think he could take down the entire operation, but if he could save even one life, it was worth it. The auction block. Rylan stopped at the edge of the central square, his gaze narrowing as he spotted a raised platform bathed in harsh, flickering light. A crowd had gathered around the stage, leering and shouting bids in alien dialects. On the platform were 5 beings, shackled and subdued, their expressions hollow from hopelessness. But it was the last figure on the platform that caught Rylan's attention. She was a young Zyrian, a species known for their crystalline hair and bioluminescent markings. Her once vibrant emerald green glow was now dimmed, her skin marred by bruises and exhaustion. Despite her frail frame, there was a defiance in her golden eyes, a spark that hadn't yet been extinguished by captivity. The auctioneer, a bloated Dracthyr, barked in his guttural voice. "This one's a rare find. Strong genetic potential, prime for breeding. Start the bidding at 25,000 credits." Rylan's fists clenched, his jaw tightening. He hated this world and its predators, but he had come prepared. Pulling a data pad from his cloak, he scanned his account balance. Years of military service had left him with enough savings to make an offer, but this wasn't going to be a clean purchase. The crowd erupted in bids, the price climbing rapidly. Rylan waited, his eyes on the auctioneer. When the bids slowed, he stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. 50,000 credits, he called out, silencing the crowd. The Dracthyr's beady eyes glinted with greed as he turned toward Rylan. A bold offer. "Do we have 60? The crowd murmured, but no one spoke up. 50,000 was a steep price, even for a Zyrian slave. "Sold," the auctioneer declared with a toothy grin. "To the hooded gentleman." Negotiations turned sour. Rylan approached the stage as the crowd dispersed, his steps slow and deliberate. The Zyrian girl watched him warily, her golden eyes flickering between mistrust and confusion. The Dracthyr auctioneer gestured for payment, his clawed hand outstretched. "Credits first," the Dracthyr said, grinning. "Then the merchandise." Rylan handed over his data pad, transferring the funds with a grimace. The Dracthyr chuckled, pleased with the transaction. But Rylan wasn't finished. "Release her," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The Dracthyr hesitated. Of course, he said, fumbling with a control device that unlocked the Zyrian shackles. As they fell to the ground, the girl stumbled, her legs weak from days of confinement. Rylan caught her before she could fall, steadying her with a firm but gentle grip. "You're safe now," he murmured. But the moment was short-lived. As Rylan turned to leave with the girl, a voice called out behind him. "Wait." A group of heavily armed enforcers stepped forward, their weapons trained on Rylan. The Dracthyr auctioneer's grin twisted into something more sinister. "Leaving so soon?" the Dracthyr sneered. "I forgot to mention there's a transaction fee. Another 10,000 credits." Rylan's eyes narrowed. "The deal's done. You got your money." "Deals on Grixis aren't that simple, human," the Dracthyr replied. "Hand over the credits, or we take her back." The Zyrian girl tensed, her grip on Rylan's arm tightening. For a moment, he considered negotiating, but the sight of the enforcer's weapons and the smirking Dracthyr pushed him over the edge. "I don't think so," Rylan said. "The fight for freedom. The The first shot came from the Enforcer's a plasma bolt that sizzled past Ryland's shoulder. His instincts kicked in immediately. In one swift motion, he pulled the girl behind a nearby crate, drawing his own sidearm from beneath his cloak. The marketplace erupted into chaos. Traders and buyers scattered, alien voices crying out in panic as Ryland returned fire. His military training took over, each shot precise and calculated. He took down 2 enforcers with ease, their armored bodies crumpling to the ground. The Dracther shouted orders, his face twisted in fury. "Get him! Don't let them escape!" Ryland glanced at the Zyrian girl, who was huddled behind the crate. "Stay low," he instructed. "And when I say run, you run. Got it?" She nodded, her golden eyes wide with fear, but filled with determination. Ryland moved like a ghost, darting between cover and picking off the enforcers one by one. Despite being outnumbered, his experience and superior tactics gave him the edge. When the last enforcer fell, he grabbed the girl's hand and sprinted toward the nearest alleyway. They weaved through the narrow streets, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. Finally, they reached the edge of the marketplace, where Ryland had stashed a small transport ship. As they boarded, the girl collapsed onto one of the seats, her breathing ragged. Ryland activated the ship's engines, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Who are you?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryland," he said simply. "And you?" She hesitated before answering. "My name is Illyria." A new beginning. The transport ship lifted off, leaving Grixis Prime behind. Ryland glanced at Illyria, who was watching him with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why did you save me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Ryland shrugged. "No one deserves to live like that." Illyria's gaze dropped to her hands, her crystalline hair shimmering faintly in the dim light. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted. "My family. They sold me to the Syndicate. I'm all that's left." Ryland's expression softened. "You can stay with me for now, at least until you figure out what you want to do next." Illyria looked up, her golden eyes meeting his. "Thank you." Ryland nodded, but deep down, he knew their journey was far from over. He had taken Illyria away from Grixis, but the Syndicate wouldn't forget her or him. As the transport ship hurtled through hyperspace, Ryland resolved to protect her at any cost. After all, he had spent his life fighting for freedom, and now, he had one more reason to keep fighting. Chapter 2. The Fallout. The hum of the transport ship's engines was a soothing constant as it soared through hyperspace. For Ryland Kane, however, there was no comfort in the sound. His mind was racing, calculating what might come next. The Zyral Syndicate didn't take kindly to losing their property, and by freeing Illyria, Ryland had painted a massive target on both their backs. Across the cabin, Illyria sat on a bench, her posture rigid and her golden eyes distant. She had cleaned up using the small facilities aboard the ship, washing away the grime of her captivity, but the trauma lingered. Her bioluminescent markings glowed faintly, an unconscious reflection of her anxiety. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. Ryland didn't turn from the cockpit's controls. "A place off the grid. An old colony outpost I know of. It's not much, but it's safe." "Safe from the Syndicate?" Illyria pressed, her voice carrying a sharp edge of fear. Ryland sighed. "For a while. But they'll come looking. They always do." Illyria's eyes dimmed, and she drew her knees to her chest. "Then why did you save me? You're putting yourself in danger for someone you don't even know." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because it was the right thing to do. You deserved better." Her lips parted as if to argue, but she closed them again. She wasn't used to kindness, not after what she'd been through. The safe haven. The ship exited hyperspace above a small, barren moon orbiting a gas giant. Its surface was pockmarked with craters, and its atmosphere was thin but breathable. In one of the larger craters was a small settlement, its domed structures barely visible from orbit. "Welcome to Outpost Jericho," Ryland said as he guided the ship into a rough landing. "It's not much, but it's home." Illyria followed him down the ramp, her feet hesitant on the dusty ground. The outpost was quiet, its residents a mix of outlaws, refugees, and those who simply wanted to disappear watching them from the shadows. Ryland led Illyria to a modest building on the edge of the settlement. Inside was a sparse but functional space. A bed, a small kitchen, and a workbench cluttered with tools and weapon parts. "It's not exactly a palace," Ryland said, tossing his jacket onto a chair. "But it's better than Grixis." Illyria wandered the room, her fingers brushing over the workbench. "It's nice," she said softly. "Safe." Ryland nodded. "For now." The Syndicate's wrath. Their reprieve was short-lived. 2 days after their arrival, a message arrived on the settlement's central communications hub. The hologram of a Zyral Syndicate enforcer flickered to life, his scaled face twisted into a cruel grin. To the residents of Outpost Jericho, the enforcer began, his voice cold and calculated. "We know you're harboring stolen property, a Zyrian female named Illyria. Turn her over within 24 hours, or we'll level your settlement." The hologram ended abruptly, leaving the room in tense silence. Ryland clenched his fists, his mind already working through their options. "They're bluffing," said Drex, a grizzled human who managed the settlement's security. "They won't waste resources attacking a place like this." "They're not bluffing," Ryland countered. "The Syndicate doesn't make empty threats. They'll come, and they'll make an example out of this place." Illyria stepped forward, her bioluminescence flickering with unease. "Then I'll go. I won't let anyone else die because of me." Ryland turned to her, his expression fierce. "You're not going anywhere." "But Dash, I didn't save you just to hand you back to them," he said firmly. "We'll fight if we have to." Drex raised an eyebrow. "You planning to take on the Syndicate by yourself?" Ryland smirked. "Not by myself. You've got a settlement full of people who know how to survive. Let's make this place a fortress." Preparing for battle. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. Ryland worked tirelessly to reinforce the settlement's defenses, turning the outpost into a makeshift stronghold. Residents who could fight were armed, and those who couldn't were assigned to secure shelters. Illyria watched as Ryland coordinated the preparations, her admiration for him growing despite her fear. She had seen many men claim to be heroes, only to crumble when faced with true danger. But Ryland was different. He didn't boast or seek recognition. He simply acted, driven by an unshakable sense of duty. As night fell, Ryland found Illyria sitting on the roof of the building, her legs dangling over the edge. Her bioluminescent markings shimmered softly in the darkness. "You should get some rest," he said, sitting beside her. "I can't," she admitted. "I keep thinking about what's going to happen. People might die because of me." "They're fighting because they believe in something," Ryland said. "In each other. In their right to live free." Illyria looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face. "Why do you care so much? About me? About any of this?" Ryland hesitated before answering. "Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. I've lost too many battles, Illyria. I won't lose this one." The battle for Jericho. At dawn, the Syndicate arrived. Their ships descended like vultures, sleek and menacing, their weapons trained on the settlement. The residents held their ground, their makeshift defenses ready for the assault. The first wave came fast and hard. Syndicate enforcers poured out of their dropships, firing plasma rifles as they advanced. Ryland led the defense, his rifle steady as he directed the resistance. The settlement's barricades held, and the defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Illyria stayed in the shelter, but her heart pounded with every sound of battle. She felt helpless, useless. But when the barricades began to falter, she made a choice. Illyria's stand. As the Syndicate pushed closer, Illyria emerged from the shelter, her bioluminescence blazing like a beacon. The sight of her startled the enforcers, giving the defenders a brief advantage. One of the Syndicate officers stepped forward, his weapon trained on her. "You're coming with us," he growled. Illyria lifted her chin, her voice steady despite her fear. "No, I'm not." Before the officer could react, Ryland appeared, taking him down with a single, precise shot. The sight of their leader falling sent the Syndicate forces into disarray, and the defenders seized the opportunity to drive them back. Within hours, the battle was over. The Syndicate retreated, their ships disappearing into the sky. The settlement was battered but intact, and its people cheered as the last enemy ship vanished. A new home. In the aftermath, the residents of Outpost Jericho rallied around Ryland and Illyria. They had proven themselves not just as survivors, but as leaders. As Ryland stood on the settlement's edge, surveying the horizon, Illyria joined him. "You saved me again," she said softly. He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We saved each other." Illyria hesitated before speaking. "I don't know what comes next, but if it's okay, I'd like to stay here with you." Ryland's smile widened. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want." For the first time in years, Illyria felt a sense of belonging. And as the settlement rebuilt, she knew she had found more than just safety. She had found a home. Chapter 3. The Syndicate's Shadow. Outpost Jericho buzzed with activity in the wake of the Syndicate's retreat. Repairs were underway, barricades were reinforced, and a new sense of solidarity filled the air. For the settlers, the victory against the Syndicate wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a statement. They could stand their ground, even against one of the galaxy's most ruthless organizations. But for Ryland Kane and Illyria, the aftermath brought no such peace. They both knew the Syndicate wouldn't let the humiliation of their defeat go unanswered. The question wasn't if they would return, it was when. The warning. It came 3 days after the battle. Ryland was inspecting the settlement's perimeter when Drex, the grizzled security manager, rushed toward him. His face was pale, his expression grim. "Ryland, we've got a problem," Drex said, handing over a datapad. Ryland scanned the screen, his jaw tightening as he read the Syndicate's ultimatum. The message was brief but chilling. "Outpost Jericho will burn. You have 1 cycle to hand over the Zyrian female, or we'll raise the entire settlement. You cannot hide from the Syndicate." Illyria appeared behind Ryland, her golden eyes flickering with unease as she glanced at the message. "They're coming back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryland nodded grimly. "And they're bringing reinforcements." The plan. A meeting was called in the settlement's main hall. The residents gathered, their faces a mix of anger and fear. Drex stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "The Syndicate won't stop," Drex said. "We've poked the bear, and now they're coming back with everything they've got. We need to make a decision." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some argued for abandoning the settlement, while others insisted on staying and fighting. Ryland stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Running won't save us. The Syndicate doesn't just want Illyria, they want to make an example out of all of us. If we give in, they'll hunt us down wherever we go." "So what do you suggest?" one settler asked, their tone skeptical. "We can't fight a full-scale Syndicate assault." "We don't have to," Ryland said. "We just need to outsmart them." A desperate gambit. Ryland outlined his plan. The settlement couldn't withstand another direct assault, but they could lure the Syndicate into a trap. Using the settlement as bait, they would draw the Syndicate forces into the nearby Dernith Gorge, a treacherous canyon filled with unstable rock formations. "We'll rig the gorge with explosives," Ryland explained. "When the Syndicate forces move in, we detonate the charges and collapse the canyon on top of them." The settlers exchanged uneasy glances. It was a risky plan, one that relied on precise timing and coordination, but it was their best shot at survival. "We'll need every able-bodied person to help," Ryland said, "and we'll need someone to lure them into the gorge." "I'll do it," Illyria said suddenly. Ryland turned to her, his expression hardening. "Absolutely not. They're after me," Illyria argued. "If they see me, they'll follow. I'm the best chance you have of getting them into the trap." Ryland hesitated, his protective instincts clashing with the logic of her argument. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you're not going alone." Setting the stage. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Explosives were planted along the gorge's cliffs, and traps were set to funnel the Syndicate forces into the kill zone. Illyria and Ryland prepared for their part in the plan, equipping themselves with everything they could carry. As the sun set on the second day, the settlers gathered to see them off. Drex clasped Ryland's hand, his expression somber. "Good luck, Kane. We'll be ready." Illyria glanced at the crowd, her bioluminescence dim as nerves tightened her chest. She felt the weight of their hope and fear pressing down on her. "We won't let them down," she promised. The lure. The Syndicate's ships arrived at dawn, their dark hulls blotting out the sky. From the cockpit of their transport, Ryland and Illyria watched as the Syndicate forces began their approach. Illyria took a deep breath, her golden eyes steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "Ready?" Rylan asked, his voice calm but firm. Illyria nodded. "Let's do this." As their transport sped toward the Syndicate forces, Illyria activated the comm system. Her voice rang out, defiant and clear. "This is Illyria, the Zyrian you're hunting. If you want me, come and get me." The Syndicate forces reacted immediately, breaking formation to pursue the transport. Rylan piloted the ship with precision, weaving through the rocky terrain as the enemy closed in. The trap. The transport led the Syndicate forces straight into Dernith Gorge, the narrow canyon walls forcing their ships into a single-file formation. As they entered the kill zone, Rylan activated the transport's cloaking system, veering into a hidden alcove. Illyria watched the enemy ships pass by, her heart pounding. Are they in position? Rylan checked the scanner. Almost. Just a little further. When the Syndicate's lead ship reached the center of the gorge, Rylan gave the signal. Now. Back at the settlement, Drex and his team activated the explosives. The charges detonated in a series of deafening blasts, sending massive chunks of rock crashing down into the gorge. The Syndicate ships had no time to react. One by one, they were crushed beneath the collapsing cliffs, their screams drowned out by the roar of destruction. Victory and loss. When the dust settled, the gorge was silent. Rylan and Illyria emerged from their hiding spot, surveying the devastation. The Syndicate forces had been annihilated, their ships reduced to smoking wreckage. "We did it," Illyria said, her voice trembling with relief. Rylan placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did." They returned to the settlement as heroes, greeted by cheers and tears of gratitude. For the first time in weeks, the settlers felt hope real, tangible hope that they could rebuild without fear of the Syndicate's wrath. A new purpose. In the days that followed, Rylan and Illyria became integral to the settlement's future. Rylan used his military experience to train the settlers, ensuring they would be ready for any future threats. Illyria, meanwhile, found her place among them, her resilience and determination inspiring those around her. One evening, as they stood on the settlement's edge, Illyria turned to Rylan. "You could have left me back on Grixis. Why didn't you?" Rylan smiled faintly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Even me." Illyria met his gaze, her golden eyes soft. "Then I guess I'll stick around. Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed." Rylan chuckled. "Fair enough." Together, they stared out at the horizon. The stars above them a reminder of the battles they had fought and the brighter future they were building. Chapter 4. The Syndicate's Vengeance. Peace was fleeting at Outpost Jericho. Though the Syndicate's forces had been crushed in the Dernith Gorge, Rylan Kane knew better than to believe their battle was over. The Syndicate was vast, its reach spanning countless systems, and the humiliation of their defeat would only fuel their fury. Rylan stood at the edge of the settlement, scanning the horizon with a pair of binoculars. The stars above seemed peaceful, but his gut told him otherwise. Illyria joined him, her bioluminescent markings glowing faintly in the dim light of dawn. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked quietly. Rylan nodded, his expression grim. "It's only a matter of time. But this time, they won't underestimate us." Illyria's golden eyes flickered with determination. "Then we'll be ready." A united front. Rylan gathered the settlers in the central square, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. Many of them were survivors of the Syndicate's oppression, and the thought of another confrontation was daunting. But Rylan's voice carried an unwavering confidence that rallied them. "We've already proven we can fight back," he said, his voice steady. "We took down their forces in the gorge, and we'll do it again if we have to. But we can't just defend ourselves, we need to send a message. The Syndicate thrives on fear. If we stand united, we show them that they can't break us." The settlers murmured in agreement, their courage bolstered by his words. Even Drex, who had once doubted Rylan's leadership, stepped forward to offer his support. "You've got my full backing, Kane," he said. "What's the plan?" Rylan laid out his strategy. They would fortify the settlement even further, setting up traps and fallback points. At the same time, they would send out a distress signal to nearby systems, rallying potential allies to their cause. If they could turn Jericho into a symbol of resistance, they might inspire others to rise against the Syndicate. The Syndicate's counterattack. The retaliation came sooner than expected. Within days, massive syndicate cruisers appeared in the skies above Jericho, their dark hulls casting ominous shadows over the settlement. The settlers scrambled into position, their newly fortified defenses bristling with weapons scavenged from the battlefield. Ryland stood at the command center, his gaze fixed on the approaching fleet. "This isn't just a raid," he said grimly. "They've brought their full might." Illyria, standing beside him, clenched her fists. "Then we'll fight with everything we have." The first wave of syndicate forces descended in dropships, their soldiers pouring out in tight formations. The settlers opened fire, their makeshift barricades holding firm as plasma bolts lit up the battlefield. Explosions rocked the ground as hidden mines detonated, taking out entire squads at a time. Ryland coordinated the defense with precision, moving from position to bolster the settlers' morale. Illyria fought alongside him, her agility and quick thinking turning the tide in several skirmishes. Though the odds were against them, the settlers held their ground, refusing to let the syndicate overwhelm them. A desperate gamble. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the syndicate's forces were overwhelming. For every dropship they took down, another seemed to take its place. The settlers were running out of ammunition, their defenses crumbling under the relentless assault. In the midst of the chaos, Drex approached Ryland, his face pale. "We can't hold them off much longer," he said. "We need a miracle." Ryland's mind raced. The settlement's distress signal had been broadcasting for hours, but no reinforcements had arrived. They were running out of time. Then, an idea struck him, a desperate, dangerous idea. "The syndicate's main cruiser," Ryland said, pointing to the massive ship hovering above the battlefield. "If we can take it out, the rest of their forces will lose coordination." Drex stared at him in disbelief. "You're talking about taking on a syndicate warship. That's suicide." "Maybe," Ryland admitted, "but it's our best shot." Illyria stepped forward, her golden eyes blazing. "I'll go with you." Ryland hesitated, his protective instincts flaring, but he knew they had no other choice. "Fine," he said, "but we'll need a diversion." Drex nodded. "Leave that to us. Just make it count." The final assault. Under the cover of the settlers' diversion, Ryland and Illyria infiltrated the syndicate's cruiser using a stolen dropship. The interior of the ship was a labyrinth of steel corridors, patrolled by heavily armed soldiers. Ryland led the way, his military training guiding them through the shadows. Their objective was the ship's power core, a massive reactor that powered its weapons and engines. If they could disable it, the cruiser would be rendered useless. They reached the reactor room, but their presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Alarms blared as syndicate soldiers swarmed the area, their weapons trained on the intruders. Ryland and Illyria fought back with everything they had. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as Ryland's precise shots took down enemy after enemy. Illyria moved with an almost otherworldly grace, her bioluminescence casting eerie shadows as she darted between foes. But the syndicate's numbers were overwhelming. Just as it seemed they would be cornered, Illyria spotted a control panel near the reactor. "Ryland," she shouted, "if I can overload the reactor, we can take out the ship." Ryland's eyes widened. "You'll kill yourself." Illyria shook her head. "Not if you cover me. Trust me." Ryland hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. "Do it." A price paid. While Ryland held off the syndicate forces, Illyria worked frantically at the control panel. Sparks flew as she bypassed the ship's security systems, her fingers moving with desperate speed. Finally, the reactor began to hum with a dangerous energy, its core glowing brighter by the second. "We've got to go," Illyria shouted, grabbing Ryland's arm. They sprinted through the corridors as the ship began to shake, explosions rippling through its hull. Syndicate soldiers scrambled to escape, their cries drowned out by the deafening roar of the reactor's overload. Ryland and Illyria reached their stolen dropship just as the reactor detonated. The cruiser erupted in a blinding explosion, its fiery remains raining down on the battlefield below. The syndicate forces, leaderless and disorganized, retreated in chaos. A new beginning. When Ryland and Illyria returned to Outpost Jericho, they were met with cheers and tears of relief. The settlement had survived, and the syndicate had been dealt a devastating blow. In the days that followed, word of Jericho's victory spread across the galaxy. Other settlements began to rise up against the syndicate, inspired by the courage of a small outpost that had refused to be broken. As the settlers celebrated, Rylan and Illyria stood on the edge of the settlement, watching the horizon. "You could leave," Rylan said softly. "You're free now. You could go anywhere." Illyria smiled, her golden eyes glowing with warmth. "Why would I leave? This is my home. And you're my family." Rylan felt a rare smile tug at his lips. "Then let's make sure it stays safe." Together, they turned back toward the settlement, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.